The morning sun peeked through the windows of the towering corporate building, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Inside, the employees of NextGen Tech hurried about their day, typing away at keyboards, sipping coffee, and chatting in hushed tones. At the very top floor sat the CEO, a sharp, determined man in his early 30s, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. He had worked hard to get here, climbing the ranks through sheer will and intelligence. But today, his mind was elsewhere. His father, a man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, had asked him for a favor. "Let me work in your company for a week," he had said. "Not as your father, as a janitor." At first, the CEO had resisted. Why would his father, a retired mechanic, want to scrub floors and empty trash cans? But his father had insisted. "I want to see the real place, not the polished version they show the boss." Reluctantly, the CEO agreed. He arranged for his father to be hired under a different name, given a janitor's uniform, and assigned to the night shift. No one would recognize him. No one would suspect a thing. The first night, the older man arrived early, pushing a mop bucket down the gleaming hallways. He kept his head down, observing everything. The way the security guards joked when no executives were around. The way some employees stayed late, not out of dedication, but because they were afraid to leave before their managers. Then, he heard something that made his hands still. Two employees in the break room, unaware they were being watched, were laughing. "Can you believe the new policy?" one said, shaking his head. "They cut our bonuses, but the big guys upstairs still get their fat checks." The other smirked. "Yeah, well, we're just numbers to them. That's why I take what I can, extra long breaks, office supplies, whatever. They don't care about us anyway." The older man said nothing. He kept mopping, his jaw tight. The next morning, he met with his son in private. "You've got a problem," he said simply. The CEO leaned forward. "What kind of problem?" "Your employees don't trust you. Some of them are stealing. Others just don't care. And the ones who do work hard? They're drowning because no one's listening." The CEO frowned. He had received glowing reports from his managers. Profits were up. Everything looked perfect on paper. But his father had seen the truth. And the truth was ugly. The CEO sat in his office, fingers steepled under his chin, replaying his father's words. "Your employees don't trust you." It gnawed at him. How could this be happening under his nose? Reports always showed high morale, productivity was steady, at least on paper. But his father had no reason to lie. He needed to see for himself. That evening, instead of leaving early as usual, he stayed behind. He dimmed the lights in his office, pretending to have left, and waited. Through the glass walls, he watched as the floor slowly emptied, except for a few stragglers. Near the copy machines, two employees from the finance department huddled together, speaking in low voices. One of them, a young man with tired eyes, rubbed his temples. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered. "They keep dumping last-minute reports on us, but if we complain, they act like we're lazy." His coworker, a woman with her hair pulled into a messy bun, sighed. "I know. And did you hear? Rumor is they're cutting department budgets again, but the execs still get their bonuses." The CEO's stomach tightened. Budget cuts? That wasn't part of any plan he'd approved. Just then, his father, dressed in his janitor's uniform, pushed his cleaning cart nearby, pretending to wipe down the windows. The older man's eyes briefly met his son's through the glass, a silent message passing between them, "See what I mean?" The next morning, the CEO called an emergency meeting with his senior managers. He didn't mention his father. Instead, he asked direct questions. "How's morale in the teams?" "Excellent," one manager said instantly. "Everyone's motivated." "Any complaints about workload?" None at all, another chimed in. Smooth sailing. The CEO's jaw clenched. Either they were lying, or they were completely out of touch. Meanwhile, his father continued his nightly rounds. The more he observed, the more he realized the problem wasn't just a few disgruntled employees, it was the culture. Favoritism, ignored concerns, even small acts of sabotage between competing departments. One night, as he emptied a trash bin near the IT department, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "You sure this won't get traced back to us?" a nervous voice asked. "Relax," another replied. "The system logs are easy to wipe. By the time they realize the data's gone, we'll be long gone with our payout." The older man's hands stilled. This wasn't just laziness or frustration, this was theft. He hurried to the nearest phone and dialed his son's private line. "We need to talk. Now." The CEO met his father in a quiet corner of the building's underground parking lot, far from any cameras or wandering ears. The older man's face was grim as he relayed what he had overheard in the IT department. "They're planning to wipe critical data and disappear," he said in a low voice. "I don't know who's paying them, but this isn't just petty theft, it's sabotage." The CEO felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Someone was trying to gut his company from the inside. He had built next-gen tech from the ground up, sacrificing sleep, weekends, even personal relationships to make it successful. And now, a handful of greedy employees were ready to burn it all down for a quick payout. "We need proof," he said finally. "If we accuse them without evidence, they'll just cover their tracks deeper." His father nodded. "Then we set a trap." The plan was simple. The CEO would let slip a fake piece of information, a confidential file containing upcoming merger details that would supposedly make stock prices soar. If the thieves took the bait, they'd try to steal and sell it. The next morning, in a meeting with department heads, the CEO casually mentioned the file. "It's highly sensitive," he said, making sure to sound just a little too careless. "Only a few of us have access. If this got out prematurely, it could ruin everything." He watched closely. Most of the managers nodded professionally, but one, the head of IT security, flinched almost imperceptibly. "Got you." Meanwhile, his father continued his janitor act, lingering near the IT wing during his shifts. He noticed small things, hushed conversations that stopped when he walked by, a junior programmer who kept glancing nervously at his boss. On the third night, his patience paid off. As he mopped near a dimly lit server room, he saw the IT security head and two others huddled around a monitor. One of them inserted a flash drive. "Once this copies, we're done," the security head muttered. "The buyer wants it by midnight." The older man didn't move, didn't breathe. He had seen enough. He texted his son a single word, "Now." Security swarmed the IT department within minutes. The thieves didn't even have time to pull the flash drive out. As they were escorted out, one of them, the junior programmer, looked ready to cry. "I didn't want to do this," he blurted. "They threatened to frame me for last year's payroll leak if I didn't help." The CEO studied him. Fear, not greed. That mattered. "Tell me everything," he said. "And we'll see." The junior programmer sat in the CEO's private office, hands shaking as he clutched a glass of water. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "I only did it because they made me," he repeated, his voice cracking. At first it was just small things, looking the other way when they accessed secure files. Then they wanted more. The CEO leaned forward, keeping his voice calm. "Who's they?" The young man swallowed hard. "It starts with the department heads. Not all of them, but there's a group. They've been skimming funds, selling data, even sabotaging projects to collect failure insurance." His eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone to burst in. "They have connections everywhere. Even security looks the other way. A cold realization settled over the CEO. This wasn't just a few bad employees, it was an organized scheme. And the people he trusted to run his company were at the center of it. Meanwhile, the CEO's father continued his janitorial duties, but something had changed. Employees who used to ignore him completely now gave him nervous glances. Word had spread about the IT department arrests, and people were jumpy. As he cleaned near the executive offices late one night, a well-dressed woman, one of the senior managers, blocked his path. "You're very observant for a janitor," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Almost like you're looking for something." The older man kept his head down, playing his role. "Just doing my job, ma'am." She leaned closer, her perfume overpowering. "Funny. Because our usual night cleaner is a woman." "Maria. Know where she is?" His grip tightened on the mop. They'd checked his cover story. Back in the interrogation room, the CEO was piecing together a disturbing picture. The corruption went deeper than he imagined. Fake vendors. Phantom employees on payroll. Even evidence that someone had been funneling money to a competitor. His phone buzzed. A text from his father, cover blown. "Be careful who you trust." The CEO's blood ran cold. He stood abruptly. "We're done here." As he rushed toward the elevators, his head of security moved to follow. "Sir? Everything all right?" "No," the CEO said sharply. "And until I know who's clean, nobody gets near my father." The security chief's hand drifted toward his radio, a little too quickly. The elevator doors slid shut just as the security chief reached for them. The CEO watched through the narrowing gap as the man's face twisted from professional concern to something darker. That split-second expression told him everything. His head of security was in on it. His phone buzzed again. A new message from his father, East Stairwell. "They're coming." The CEO jammed the emergency stop button. The elevator jerked to a halt between floors. He pried open the maintenance hatch in the ceiling just as the elevator's alarm began blaring. On the 14th floor, the CEO's father moved quickly but quietly. The senior manager who'd questioned him had disappeared to make a phone call. He had maybe 5 minutes before trouble arrived. He ducked into an empty conference room and texted his son again, "Meet at loading dock. Back exit blocked." As he turned to leave, the door burst open. 3 security guards stood there, flashlights cutting through the dark. "Well, well," said the one in front, not a guard at all, but the CFO in a borrowed uniform. "The janitor who isn't a janitor." The CEO dropped down into the elevator shaft, his dress shoes slipping on the greasy cables. 3 floors below, he kicked open a service door just as his phone lit up with an alert from the building's security system. "Motion detected, Executive Conference Room B." The feed showed his father surrounded. But what made his stomach drop was seeing who else appeared in the frame, the company's general counsel, calmly adjusting his tie as he strolled into view. His father's voice came through clearly on the audio, "Counselor. I should have known it would be you." The older lawyer smiled. "And I should have recognized you at the holiday party. But then, no one looks at the help, do they?" The CEO changed direction, heading not for the loading dock but for his private office. There was one thing they wouldn't expect him to go for, the old-fashioned fire axe behind his desk. As he rounded the corner, he nearly collided with his assistant. "Sir." "Thank God," she gasped. "Security's gone crazy, they're saying there's an intruder." He grabbed her shoulders. "Are you clean?" Her eyes widened. "What?" "The embezzlement. The data theft. Did you know?" She shook her head violently. "No. But, I suspected something. The way certain files always went missing after board meetings." The CEO made a snap decision. "Come with me." Back in the conference room, the CFO was getting impatient. "Where is he? Your son should have come running by now." The older man smiled. "You don't know my boy. He's smarter than that." The general counsel checked his watch. "We're wasting time. Secure him in the server room until this is over." As the guards moved forward, the fire alarm suddenly blared to life. Sprinklers erupted from the ceiling, drenching everyone in the room. In the chaos, the CEO's father lunged for the CFO's wrist, twisting it until the man dropped his phone. With one stomp, the device shattered under his work boot. "First rule of real work," he grunted. "Always keep your hands free." The sprinklers continued to rain down as the CEO's father made his move. Water dripped from his gray hair as he drove his shoulder into the nearest guard, sending the younger man stumbling back into a conference table. The element of surprise wouldn't last long. Across the room, the general counsel was shouting into his radio. "Lock down the building. No one gets in or out." The older man ducked as another guard swung at him. His muscles remembered the combat training from decades ago, the quick pivots, the precise strikes. A well-placed elbow to the ribs dropped the second guard gasping to his knees. But the CFO was smarter. He didn't fight. He ran. Meanwhile, the CEO and his assistant were taking the service stairs 2 at a time. "They'll expect you to go to your father," the assistant panted. "We need another plan." The CEO stopped on the landing, water from the sprinklers dripping down his face. "The security hub. If we can access the main system." "Already on it." The assistant pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "I've been backing up all suspicious activity for months. Just in case." The CEO stared at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" She met his gaze steadily. "You weren't ready to hear it." A loud crash from the floor above shook them both back into motion. The CFO sprinted through the executive wing, heading for his office. He needed just 30 seconds to wipe the evidence from his private server. He skidded around the corner and froze. The CEO's father stood waiting, breathing heavily but blocking the doorway. "Going somewhere?" The CFO's hand went to his waistband. "Don't make this messy." The older man's eyes flicked to the glint of metal. "That's your mistake right there." "What?" "Thinking I care about getting shot." He charged. The CEO and his assistant burst into the security hub to find 2 guards scrambling at their monitors. "Sir. There's been a..." "Stand down," the CEO ordered. "That's a direct order." The guards hesitated. The assistant stepped forward, pulling up files on her phone. "Look at this. Unauthorized data transfers. Altered security logs. You've been used." As the guards scanned the evidence, their expressions changed. One reached slowly for his radio. "All units, this is Davis. Stand by for verified orders from the CEO only." The CEO nodded his thanks, then turned to the camera feeds. One monitor showed his father and the CFO struggling near the executive offices. Another showed the general counsel moving toward the emergency exits. "Seal the building," the CEO said. "No one leaves." The CFO's gun skittered across the floor as the older man twisted his wrist with a sickening pop. The executive screamed, collapsing against the wall. "You'll never prove anything," the CFO spat through the pain. "Everything's encrypted. Untraceable." The CEO's father hauled him up by his collar. "You corporate types always forget something." "What?" "Real work leaves real marks." He jerked the man's sleeve up, revealing fresh scratches on his forearm. "Like the ones you got moving server racks last night. Forensics will match these to every cabinet you touched." Footsteps pounded down the hall as security arrived, real security this time. The CEO was right behind them, his face a mask of cold fury. The CFO sagged in defeat. It wasn't personal. The CEO looked at the gun on the floor, then at his father. It never is. The security team hauled the CFO away, his expensive shoes dragging across the wet carpet. The CEO watched until they turned the corner, then finally allowed himself to breathe. His father stood beside him, rubbing his shoulder where the fight had taken its toll. "You all right?" the CEO asked quietly. The older man nodded. "Just reminds me I'm not 20 anymore." He glanced at the assistant, who was still typing rapidly on her phone. "She's good." The CEO followed his gaze. "Yeah. Turns out the best people were right in front of me the whole time." His assistant looked up, her face grim. "Sir, you need to see this. I just cracked the CFO's backup files." The executive conference room smelled of wet upholstery and fear. The CEO, his father, and the assistant huddled around a laptop as damning evidence scrolled across the screen. 3 years, the CEO murmured, staring at transaction records. "They've been doing this for 3 years. His father pointed at a series of coded entries. "What are these?" The assistant zoomed in. "Shell companies. They've been funneling money through at least 6 different." She froze as a familiar name appeared. The CEO's stomach dropped. "That's our biggest investor." Silence hung heavy in the room. This wasn't just internal theft. It was corporate espionage. Down in the holding room, the CFO sat handcuffed to a chair, his usual polished demeanor shattered. When the CEO entered, the man didn't even look up. "You realize what this means," the CEO said, placing the laptop in front of him. "You didn't just steal from me. You stole from everyone who believed in this company." The CFO's laugh was hollow. "You still don't get it. That investor owns 30% of your board seats. You really think they'll let you expose this?" The CEO leaned down, his voice deadly calm. "Watch me." Morning light streamed through the windows as employees began arriving, confused by the night's events. The water damage. The absent executives. The armed guards at every entrance. The CEO stood in the lobby, his father beside him in clean clothes, no longer pretending. Workers whispered as they passed, some recognizing the older man from his janitor act. "What now?" his father asked. The CEO watched a young intern help an older secretary navigate around a wet floor sign. "We rebuild," he said. "Starting today." His assistant approached, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "The press release is ready when you are." He took the coffee gratefully. "Any word on the general counsel?" Airport security caught him trying to board a flight to Belize. She hesitated. "There's something else. The staff, they're scared." The CEO nodded. They had every right to be. At precisely 9 a.m., every computer screen in the building changed simultaneously. The CEO's face appeared, broadcast from his office. "To all NextGen employees," he began, "last night, several senior executives were arrested for embezzlement, data theft, and conspiracy." A murmur swept through the cubicles. "I won't lie to you, this goes deep. But here's what happens next." He held up a flash drive. "Every transaction. Every backdoor deal. It's all here. And it's all going to the authorities." His image was replaced by a single slide, NextGen Truth Initiative with a list of reforms. Whistleblower protections. Open financials. Employee oversight seats on the board. In the break room, a group of junior staffers burst into spontaneous applause. The press called it, the NextGen Reckoning. News vans crowded the corporate plaza for days as investigators hauled out boxes of evidence. The CEO watched from his office window as his former CFO was led away in handcuffs, the man's tailored suit now wrinkled, his head bowed low. His father stood beside him, sipping black coffee. "You ready for what comes next?" The CEO turned to face the older man. Honestly? No. But we'll figure it out. A knock interrupted them. The assistant entered, her arms full of files. The staff votes are in. She placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. They've chosen their 3 representatives for the oversight board. The CEO scanned the names, 2 veteran employees he expected, and 1 surprise. He looked up at his assistant. You? She shrugged, but her eyes were determined. They asked me. And someone needs to keep you honest. The next week brought hard decisions. Some department heads kept their jobs after proving they'd been coerced. Others walked out with security escorts. Through it all, the CEO did something radical. He told the truth. At an all-hands meeting, he stood before his entire staff, no teleprompters, no prepared speech. We're keeping the lights on because of the people who spoke up, he said simply. The janitors who noticed missing equipment. The interns who reported strange requests. The IT staff who tracked unauthorized logins. He paused, looking across the sea of faces. From now on, if you see something, say something. And I promise, you'll be heard. When he finished, the applause lasted 5 full minutes. His father found him late that night, still in the office. You should go home. Get some sleep. The CEO rubbed his eyes. Still too much to do. The older man sat across from him. You know, I came here thinking you'd lost touch. But watching you these past weeks. He shook his head. You remind me of when you were 10 years old, trying to fix that broken bike all by yourself. The CEO smiled. I seem to remember you showing me how. Only after you'd skinned your knees enough times to ask for help. His father leaned forward. That's all anyone wants, son. To be asked. The next morning brought one last surprise. The assistant walked in holding a newspaper. The headline read, Investor implicated in NextGen scandal steps down. That's not all, she said, handing him her tablet. Look at the stock price. The CEO blinked. Despite the scandal, shares had risen 15% overnight. Analysts were calling it the transparency bump. His father chuckled. Turns out honesty really is the best policy. 6 months later, the changes had taken root. Open-door policies. Anonymous suggestion boxes that actually got responses. Monthly, Ask Me Anything sessions where the CEO answered every question, even the uncomfortable ones. On the anniversary of the scandal, the company threw an unusual party. There were no stuffy speeches in the executive suite. Instead, the celebration filled the entire first floor, engineers chatting with custodial staff, managers serving food alongside interns. The CEO's father manned the grill outside, flipping burgers in an apron that read World's Okayest Janitor. When his son came to check on him, he handed over the spatula. Your turn, he said. And don't burn them this time. As the CEO fumbled with the burgers, laughing at his own mistakes, employees saw something rare, a leader who wasn't afraid to be human. And in that moment, NextGen Tech finally became what its name promised, not just a company, but a community.